Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your patience. We are about to start our session 4, and I will call our moderator for this session, Reverend Dr. Keith Russell.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for returning after the 3-minute break. We have some wonderful presenters for you this afternoon as well, and I'm going to not hinder us. We'll move straight into it. Our first presenter is Keisha Ellis. She's a young professor, School of English Studies, University of the Bahamas. Keisha Ellis is a writer and political scientist born and living in the Bahamas. In 2017, she published The People's Constitution, a layman's interpretation of the Constitution of the Bahamas, and eagerly awaits the opportunity to release an updated version once constitutional reform is achieved. She writes fiction, and her work has been published by Tongues of the Ocean, Woman Speak, Ada, and Ponciana Paper Press. She also engages in the revolutionary acts of being a married woman in the Bahamas and mother to 3 children in the age of late-stage capitalism and disenchantment. The topic of our paper, of our presentation today, is Black activism in the Bahamas and how it connects us to or disconnects us from the rest of the Caribbean. Let us welcome Keisha Ellis.
Hello, everyone. If it's okay with y'all, I'm going to stand. All right. Does that work? Is this okay? All right. Hello, everyone. So yes, if you've been following the program and if you were listening, I promised to speak this afternoon on Black activism in the Bahamas and how it connects or disconnects us from the rest of the Caribbean. And there are a number of things that I wanted to discuss. I especially wanted to focus on the 1960s, right? The diasporic Black consciousness that was spreading around that time. I wanted to discuss the political changes that were taking place in Caribbean nations during that time. I, of course, would discuss the Progressive Liberal Party, majority rule, Lyndon Pindling, all of that. And in my research, I came across a speech. Well, I came across a speech quite a while ago. It was given by Lyndon Pindling in 1967, and I found this speech in a collection called The Speeches of Lyndon Pindling, which was a document released by the Progressive Liberal Party, and I found it on a website called progressiveliberalparty.org. That website has since gone away. They no longer use that website, and I actually haven't been able to locate this document again. So I was very happy that I had saved it 10 years ago when I came across it. And this speech, which is entitled Have Faith in Us, was given by Sir Lyndon Pindling. It was his press conference immediately after taking the oath of Premier as the Bahamas, of the Bahamas in 1967, January 16th. All right, so this is a press conference given by Lyndon Pindling immediately after taking the oath of Prime Minister, and it's entitled, Have Faith in Us. I will read the first 2 paragraphs of this very short speech. Whenever an upset occurs in an election anywhere in the world, those who have capital at stake are likely to react with doubt, even fear. Let me therefore reassure our friends abroad that my government will foster the climate of free enterprise that they have come to expect in the Bahamas. Our plans for the pleasure of tourists call for more, not less. Our plans for the confidence of investors call for immediate person-to-person conference with leaders both here and abroad. High on the program of my government will be to give the assurance to President Lyndon Johnson that these islands will remain friendly, These islands will continue to play their role in the defense pattern of the Western world, and these islands will no longer be a haven for gangsters. We are determined to be a good neighbor and a good partner. The investor doesn't mind who is in power. They don't mind whether it is the PLP or the UBP. We intend to create a climate for safety for capital in this country. It will be safer and cheaper. It still physically pains me to read those words. I understand. I am not a simple-minded person. I understand why a newly elected black man in the 1960s in the Caribbean would find it prudent to assure Americans that there was no way that he was going to go down that Marxist road that all of those other fools were going down, right? Not us, not here. And regardless of what he promised black Bahamians in general, regardless of all of that, regardless of what was said in order for the election to be won for the right side, he found it necessary to assure everyone that, don't worry, it'll all be exactly the way it was yesterday. It would all be exactly the way that you've wanted it and the way that benefits you. We'll see what happens with the people I made other promises to. We'll see what they can get out of all of this. All right, so I was going to go from there and talk about the modern day Bahamas, talk about how foreign direct investment is still the foundation of any national development that we have. I would talk about current political activism, right? And specifically, I would have had the displeasure of talking about the Coalition of Independence, right? And while their website and their platform is quite broad, they talk about the redistribution of wealth and Bahamians taking ownership of the country. The political traction that they've found recently is all based upon the hatred of Haitians, right? That is the foundation upon which they have gained strength and traction. And when you see people standing on the side of the road collecting money for the Coalition of Independence, it's not to ensure that education is more equitable or equitably distributed throughout the Family Islands, right? It's to help them raid shanty towns and harass people on their way to work, right? That is what they're collecting money for, and that is what the Bahamian population, and too large a part of it, has been jockeying behind, all right? So all of this is what I'm like, okay, this is my research, this is what I have been researching for a while. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about how the Bahamas has never truly desired or sought to connect itself with the rest of the Caribbean, with Africa. We've always taken every opportunity to align ourselves with the US or Europe or, you know, any other European country that would show us any interest, right? And I thought, okay, so what am I going to stand up here and talk about? I'm going to talk about how Bahamians have no identity outside of tourism, right? Then I thought, okay, so I'll talk about how Bahamians value our proximity and relationship with the US above all things. All right, I was going to talk about how Bahamians despise poor black people. All right, and then I realized that these are the same things that we have been saying for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? There is nothing new in my presentation, unfortunately. The names have changed, the story remains the same, all right? And I became very pessimistic. I'm like, okay, I can go all the way to Freeport, right, and stand up here and talk about how we pride ourselves on being the favorite house Negro, right? And we will go out of our way to beat down any other black person we see approaching Mass's porch, all right? And to be honest, I got a little disillusioned, and I said, I don't know if I want to do that, right? I don't think that I have anything new or valuable to add to that conversation, especially not in this room of really great academics, intellectuals, revolutionary thinkers. I don't think that I am the person to stand up here and really paint that picture any better than we've already had so far. So what happened is I went down a rabbit hole. Right? I'm like, okay, what are we gonna do? I mentioned those 3 children I raised in, right? And I'm like, what can we actually do to change this narrative? So that when we commemorate the 100th year of our independence, we're talking about something different, right? And I thought, I honestly thought, I was like, should I buy a boat? Right? Should I just go out and buy a boat? And by extension, should every Bahamian living in the Bahamas just go buy a boat? All right, and then of course, because I'm a very sensible person, right? I'm known for how sensible I am. I was like, of course not. That's the dumbest thing you've ever thought, Keisha. Don't go buy a boat. Everyone knows you don't go buy a boat. Right? And I listed all of the reasons, and they were very easy to come to. Why should I not buy a boat? Right? And of course, the first reason, the number one reason why I should not buy a boat right now is because I am not white. I am not a white person, right? And in this country, right, one of the first important features, right, of boat owners is that they are white, all right? At least Conky Joe, all right? And if you can't manage to be one of those 2 things, you gotta be red. You gotta at least be red, right? I'm not even red. I am a dark-skinned, black Bahamian woman, right? I have no business owning a boat, right? Secondly, I am not rich. I am not a rich person living in this country. Therefore, I have no right to own a boat. All right? But those 2 things aside, there's an exception we make, right, for not rich black Bahamians to own a boat, and it's very important that they live on a family island. You cannot live in Nassau, be poor and black, and talk about you on a boat. That is just not sound judgment, right? It's not a good investment. It is not a sensible thing to do. It is not a good example to set. It is a waste of money, right? Because a boat is a hole in the ocean you throw money into, right? That's something I've heard my entire life, right? A boat is for, boats are for white people and drug dealers, right? Right? Those are the classes of people who are allowed to own boats, right? So I thought, no, of course not. If we're actually talking about revolutionary change, changing the consciousness of people in this country, right, changing our identity and the way we connect to this country, right, I thought, okay, there must be something else, right? But unfortunately for me, I'm also a pacifist, right? So while I read Frantz Fanon at every age, right, far too young, and again, very recently, and so I understand the importance of violence, right? I understand the call to react to cruelty and inhumanity and extreme violence with more of that, because it is very difficult to see a way forward. It is very difficult to see beyond a gun barrel pointed at your face. All right, so I understand that, right? But as a pacifist, I went back to the boat, right? And I'm like, maybe there's something there. And I thought about it. Boats are expensive. They are a poor investment. All right, there are more important things for middle-class black Bahamians to strive to spend their money on. And I thought about what are some of these things, all right? Then I realized those things are just as expensive. We're talking about cars, right? It is a reasonable and sensible thing to do for someone to save up to buy a car so that they can get to work, right? Homes, poor Dr. Davis, right? And that tragedy he told us earlier today about his situation with the mortgage. Yet, Yet we explain to ourselves and to our children that that is a reasonable decision for them to take. It is reasonable for you to go to an exploitive institution like a Canadian-owned bank, right? Sign up for a 40-year mortgage, get a life insurance policy to protect them and their investment, and then work, and then be beholden to any employer that you can get for 40 years to ensure that you can continue to pay for that home. That is expensive. That takes maintenance and upkeep. It's not just the mortgage, right? You also have house insurance. You gotta paint it. There will be cracks. There will be changes. It will need a new roof, right? There is constant maintenance needed in a home. Yet no one will say a home is not worth it, right? Education is expensive. And if you're fool enough to keep going, after grade 12, it gets even more expensive. It takes maintenance. It takes a time commitment, right? But no one in this room will tell your children it is not worth it to get an education, right? We have valued these things. And speaking of children, there's nothing more expensive than them. There is no greater commitment of money, time, energy than children, right? But they are also our greatest gift, and perhaps one of the reasons why we are doing any of this anyway, right? So there are things, right? We've decided as a society that, yes, some things are expensive, but they are worth it. We have just decided that for Black Bahamians, boats are not one of those things for various reasons, right? And the difference with those things is that we as a society have agreed that they are worth it. And we build our society around helping people build and grow toward having them, while also deciding that boat ownership is not valuable for average Black Bahamians. That is something that we have decided, and that is tied to our political history, right? That is tied to the notion of working in a hotel, not staying at a hotel, right? That is part of the message behind Lyndon Pinlin donning a bellboy uniform and lifting luggage and saying, see, none of you are better than this. We should all be so happy to lift the luggage of tourists, right? And so these are the messages that are soaking into us, right? These are the messages that get into us and form our idea of what it means to be a good Bahamian, what it means to be a Bahamian, what it is we owe our country, and what it is our country owes us. All right, so when we talk about these ideas of national identity and why it is that Bahamians have no interest in aligning ourselves with the Caribbean or with Africa, it's because at every instant, we've reminded ourselves that the best place to be is sweeping the floor of Master's house, all right? And I cannot sincerely think of a concrete, tangible thing that we can do immediately to start changing this, all right? Because education takes a long time. Finding a politician worth voting for is a ridiculous notion, right? So we cannot stand there and say, the government should do this, politicians should do this, right? We have been saying that, right? One of the first politicians that we had faith in decided to tell the other people that they should have faith in him. Right? One of the first politicians that we really hung our hopes and dreams and aspirations on told the same economic and political forces that we thought we were fighting, don't worry. Doesn't matter if it's the PLP or the UBP in power. Y'all are good. Y'all are straight. All right? So let's get down to this into a little bit more. Right? So, yes. We should all go buy, build, borrow a boat. right? And why? And of course, I was so impressed with the 7 suggestions that we got last night that, I decided, yeah, I'm going to come today, I could be biggity, right? I'm telling you what we need to do, right? What we need to do is each of us own a boat, right? And why? Well, how do I see boat ownership among middle-class Black Bahamians as really being a tangible thing that changes the reality that we face in this country, right? And the simplest and easiest one, of course, is food security. The ocean is full of food, right? In one of my other lives, I run a food bank, right? Every day I deal with families who cannot afford to feed themselves, feed their children, right? Every day. And what I realize that when I deal with these families is that they have a harder time recognizing food that doesn't have a label. All right, if the food is not in a package, not as a label, we didn't pay VAT on it, it's almost like, oh, you're giving me scraps. All right? One of our favorite breakfasts and lunches in this country, tuna, right? All right, we built, that's a part of our culture. That's a part of our culture. Tuna and grits is a part of our culture, right? But the tuna that we're referring to is canned tuna brought in from God knows where, right? Put into a can, sold for us for far too much money, right? And then opened with a can opener, right? When we have an ocean of fish. And I know that we like to talk old stories. We like to talk about what our grandma used to eat, what our grandfather used to eat, and how it was growing up on the island and all that. We've romanticized these notions as a way to tuck them away and leave them alone. Isn't that cute what grandma used to eat? Right? And we pretend to revere that, but in actuality, we scorn it. Right? In actuality, we've scorned it because we've built our entire identity around getting to Nassau, living in a cramped apartment, right? And getting to that job, wherever you go in, right? But we all got a boat right now. We would put a real dent in food insecurity in this country, right? What else could we do? Of course, income. Owning a boat can be a source of income, right? After you fed your family, you might have more fish to sell, right? And that's just the most unimaginative idea of what we can do with boat ownership in terms of income, right? There are industries connected to being a seafaring people. There's boat building, which is actually something that we were known for. Bahamians were known for building boats. So it annoys me when I hear Bahamians say, oh, we can't afford, you know how expensive boats are? Yes, they are expensive, which is why we should go back to building them so that we can sell them, right? Owning a boat can also lead to something that I call revolutionary income, right? And this is what I mean by that. So in my world as a food bank, right, I speak to a lot of food purchasers, right? A lot of wholesalers, a lot of restaurants and chefs. And I'm like, what is this sway situation or swy situation, right? Why are we eating all of this foreign fish, right? When we live in an archipelago, our country is mostly water, right? And here's what they say. They say, you know how hard it is to get a Bahamian fisherman to go out fishing? I was like, really? Yeah, they said this is a problem they have with Bahamian fishermen. Bahamian fishermen will take the boat out for a week, 2 weeks, get enough fish to survive for however long they've decided they need to survive. All right, once they have enough fish to cover their expenses for 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, they come back and they don't go back out until they need more fish. This is a capitalist nightmare. Can you imagine? Can you imagine a group of people who work as much as they need to but not more? What are they doing with all that free time? Right? That is a nightmare. And even when I say that to people, it's always like, oh, tisk, tisk, tisk. Those Bahamian fishermen, how dare they only work as much as they need to? Right? And it's because we have no concept of that. Right? Especially if we have that mortgage. Right? As much as you need to is 20 hours a day. Right? So once we get back on the ocean and start controlling more of this again, let's see where our minds go. Let's see what opens up beyond just the lens of hotels, of banking, of accounting, right? And those are just the practical reasons why we should all go get a boat right now, right? There are the more intangible things. There's that connection to and stewardship of the ocean, right? It's the realizing that the ocean is our connection to each other. It's our connection to our ancestors. It's our connection to ourselves. It's just an appreciation of it. It's an exploration of opportunities for research. I am tired of other people telling our stories. I went to the Maritime Museum, the brand new Maritime Museum, and I couldn't enjoy it. I wanted to, but I could not enjoy hearing the stories of other people that came to our water and discovered things in it. Right? And that should be us, that could be us, but we have been told and we have believed that we don't want it, that it is not really ours. All right? And I think perhaps one of the most important things that we could give ourselves from boat ownership is leisure and pleasure, the two things upon which our entire economy is based. Our economy, our culture, our identity is based upon leisure and pleasure for other people. And that is a travesty. All right? It is something that we have not even thought to demand. What do we demand of politicians? Work, jobs, anything, right? And because that's all we've demanded from them, that's all that they have to promise us, right? All they have to promise us is, hey, if you elect me, I'll sell this entire island and you can all get a job, right? And we've decided, okay, that is good enough. All right? That is what we want from this country. Right? We have some of the richest people on the planet living in the Bahamas. Some of the richest people on the planet have chosen to make the Bahamas their home. Right? Because they get a part of the Bahamas that we don't have access to. We know it exists because we see it in pictures and we brag about it. Right? And when we see the commercials for the Bahamas and the Super Bowl, we're very proud of it. Right? So we know it exists, but we also know that it's not really for us. All right? So I really think that something as silly and simple as owning a boat, a kayak, a surfboard, anything like that, anything getting you off of the land, out of traffic, right, out of the office building, and into your birthright can lead to the kind of shift in consciousness that we will not get through political change or any kind of political change that will happen within my lifetime, right? Education is important as well, but education itself will only go so far, especially when the reality of the situation that these children are living in and what we're teaching them to aspire to is something that maintains the status quo. All right? So I really think that something like this can lead to a shift in value and therefore a shift in consciousness and therefore a shift in the topic that we're discussing in 50 years. All right? I truly believe that for Black Bahamians, owning a boat is a revolutionary act. I do. And I'm going to end here with a quote by the great Audre Lorde, who said that Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Keisha. I can't wait for the questions. Our second presenter is Ian Bethel Bennett. He's Executive Director of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas and Associate Professor, School of English Studies, University of the Bahamas. Dr. Bethel Bennett currently works with a decolonial practice examining space and place and their impact on identities and development. He's exploring the continued coloniality of place and space making in the Caribbean, notwithstanding a place's independence. This also informs cultural expression and the ways violence and gender are performed. His presentation is entitled, You Better Know Your Place, Race, Class, Gender, and the Coloniality of Bahamian Space. Let's welcome Dr. Bennett.
Good morning. I don't know how I can follow Keisha's presentation. So the project really started years ago. And I guess the violence of the neoliberal moment has only compounded the violence of the encounter that we learned at QC as that wonderful school on Village Road that was the discovery of the Bahamas in 1492. Nobody ever taught us anything other than it was the discovery of the Bahamas. Nobody said that it was one of the most violent experiences you can live through and come after. Never mind that. That's unimportant. Then they didn't talk about the fact that when the English came, they brought law with them that decided that the act of settlement determined that we did not exist prior to that nothing was here. They set up civilization and they saved us from ourselves. That's okay. That's fine. That law has continued, as Michael so eloquently put it. And what astonishes me is that we, as Bahamians, don't really talk about the coloniality of space or the coloniality of being. And I owe that to one of my University of Puerto Rico colleagues, Nelson Maldonado Torres, who works with Aníbal Quijano on the coloniality of being and the coloniality of power. Nobody talks about the coloniality of power. Power is deeply colonial. It is white, masculine, capitalist, patriarchal, and very racist. Never mind. So as I step into the public sphere, you are to move out of my way, especially if you are a black male or a black female, a non-white anybody. The space I inhabit is in a dark, cramped, mass climbing on the walls, fouling up the place. It's a place that people don't want to go to. So when we look at place making as opposed to space making, we have to understand that place making is about what Keisha was talking about in terms of the tourism. That whole model that we have built this place on, that then denies us the space to be in that place. Again, not important. I grew up in a family that we had little boats, and we would take those little boats and go out to sea and fish. And while we were out there, we got away from the violence of Nassau, because Nassau can be a very violent place. We also grew up in Harbor Island, where there was no electricity and no water. Imagine, the water would go off on a Friday and come back maybe by Tuesday. It was depopulated because there was very little development there. It had been very populated at one point. Bahamian history doesn't really talk about these problems that remain with us. So I want to start with a story that I grew up going to a house between Dowsville Street and Bay Street on Dunmore Lane. The house is still there, and I was supposed to have photographs of how we lived and how it looks now. Family still own it. So the house is in a white zone, right? Bay Street is white. Nassau is white. Until the flight from Nassau, Nassau was a very white space. But what does whiteness look like? Again, if we go back to the coloniality of power, the proximity to power means the proximity to whiteness. However, English law, and by extension Bahamian law, establishes that it's all class-based now. It's no longer white, it's classed, but it's also masculine. And it denies space for women who are women of all races, but of a certain class, then you can come in to a certain extent. You can get to the front porch, but can you be in the inner chamber? So all these questions just come up because I'm trying to figure out how we inhabit space. So that house that we lived in had a front porch that we all sat on, hardly going down into the street. The bank was on the corner of Bay Street and Dunmore Lane, and we knew all the neighbors. Right behind us was Johnson Alley, very different group of people. Don and Tate and all of these guys look at me as if I'm crazy when I talk about Dowsville Street being a mecca of population. I would walk from St. John's Prep, come down Bay Street, and go to my aunt's house. St. John's Prep was on George Street. George Street was very populated when I was a child. People would sit out on their porches and you would speak to them because you had to speak to them. All of that has gone, so Nassau has died. There was a flight out of Nassau. With that flight out of Nassau was a flight of black families from over the hill into the suburbs. Any problem with that? Keisha, you got a problem with that? No. However, there is an existential crisis that we are not recognizing. The fact that we have been dislocated, displaced by this new mapping of, and unmapping of coloniality. The space remains deeply colonized because it was never decolonized. Decolonizing means that you actually challenge the power imbalances that exist. So again, I grew up in a family where women owned land and they owned homes. They may have had to fight tenaciously to keep them, but they did that. So when I come into the 21st century Bahamas with this screaming that, why are these women running families? They're destroying the Bahamian family. I'm like, what? Hold on. I don't understand. What is going on? So the spatial reorganizing has allowed a kind of slippage and erasure of cultural understanding that what is going on. So this work jumps over placemaking into understanding the organization of space and the use of spatial injustice to disempower people, to make them less than. So once you move people off or out, they lose sight of their community. They lose connection to that place, that space, that inner sanctum that may be 2x4, but it is an essential part of identity formation. So we look at all of this through the eyes of David Harvey, who is, I guess, a Marxist geographer who talks about the remaking of space in the neoliberal moment. And I used Soja's idea of spatial injustice and looking at the way public space actually interacts with private space. Private space trumps public space, and we have allowed private space to now trump public space. Public space is not actually public because the coloniality of public space tells us that blacks have a very different relationship with space because you need to know how to carry yourself in that public space. If you do not carry yourself respectably, you will be removed from public space. If you manifest for your rights in public space, you will be asked to leave unless you have permission to do so. And permission to do so means that you have gone to the Commissioner of Police and applied for a permit. All of this is colonial, but we don't see that. We don't see the way that power works through the colonial frame to control what we do. That's fine. So the other moment came when Ian organized Sustainable Grand Bahama Conference after Dorian. And there were people standing there telling us as Bahamians that we were irresponsible because we did not pay for insurance, we did not pay for recovery, we did not pay for this, we did not pay for that. We needed to have insurance. So in Abaco and Grand Bahama, a lot of the population lives in poverty or marginal existence. So when we look at spatial injustice, it means that the money that you have to spend to buy insurance, that means you can no longer buy food. Let's not discuss that, right? Because this is not a part of neoliberal class or race injustice. This is about climate change. And as the man says, climate change is racist, but we don't talk about the racism of climate change. We also don't talk about the coloniality of the space that is mapped or remapped when climate change moves people from the coast. And when the land becomes too valuable to have poor black people living on that land, or when the land becomes too valuable to have dead black people inhabiting those spaces and you remove the cemetery, take the headstones, put them somewhere else, as happened on East Bay Street, but we don't talk about that either. Silence is a colonial weapon to empower itself by disempowering others. Yet we are happy to be silent, inflicting violence on ourselves, on our bodies, on our souls. It's okay. And when we look at the ways that space is reorganized in the neoliberal moment, so between 2012 and 2023, Bay Street has been completely remapped. It has been killed. It has died. But it's by design. This is a spatial design that will rearrange everything and remove those derelict buildings that represent a part of Bahamian history, remove the memories that go along with those buildings, and remap what is already privately owned land through colonial land grants. That's okay. In a small church in Barbados after Dorian, the congregation donated every week to the Dorian Fund in Grand Bahama and Abaco. They had no idea who these people were. They knew that they were fellow impoverished people or fellow black people. This is a working class community. Nobody ever thanked them. Nobody told the people in the Bahamas who were to receive this money that this was coming from a small working class Anglican church in Barbados. Did the money come? The banking system and the insurance systems are all, as everybody keeps talking about, colonial, but we don't call them that. They're also imperial. They are designed to rape, pillage, and empower those that they wish to empower, like the Hudson Bay Company. So if we begin by unpacking the ways that space is organized, as Edward Soja says, space is politically organized. The uneven development of Nassau, to look at the way it has been mapped out recently, is obvious. It's also class-based, but it's also very masculinist and very designed for a particular need. The new port that is coming on will remove land from Bahamian hands and put it into a transnational capitalist corporation's hands. That's fine. It will give us jobs. What we need are jobs. So the spatial reorganization and neoliberal speak are a form of spatial injustice that we are often silenced by, but we're more silenced by our proximity to relations with our cousins who are political, or with the way space is simply class, race, and gendered. So women should not speak out because it's a problem, especially if you are a black working class woman who is less educated. How do you speak up? If the subaltern is silenced within the official space, where does she or he find voice? So the violence that comes with this know your place is huge. You better know your place. I don't know my place, but I am constantly reminded that I am stepping out of line when I talk about these things, especially when I talk about the root of a lot of gender-based violence being in spatial dislocation and the violence of, or the genocide of colonialism. But we don't talk about that. So as Nassau is being remapped, so is Harbor Island. So is Eleuthera. So is Freeport. That's okay. So there is this concept in Marxist capitalist conundrum called accumulation by dispossession. And Harvey talks about it, Marx talks about it, and then this guy called Schmidt talks about it in relation to tourism. So what tourism does is it comes in and it accumulates space, takes it out of the commons, and puts it into private hands. The World Bank then comes and tells you this is a good thing because it is going to give you, your GDP is going to go up, your people will be employed, and the population will be happier. They do not tell you that your people cannot be employed in those positions because they are not educated adequately to fit those roles, or they will start certifying how people can move through those spaces, such as the neoliberal, transnational, capitalist, classed space. To that end, if we look at the reorganization of Nassau, standing in the National Art Gallery, I can no longer look out and see water. I see a building that is owned by another country, that has nothing to do with the Bahamas, that has removed a part of Bahamian history from access to Bahamians, or to anyone, in fact. As long as the space is derelict, it will continue to be impoverished. As I walk up the hill with a group of employees of local businesses one afternoon, there is a big activity on the front street. We go out, we come back, and we're told that we cannot access the road that leads to where we are going. Why? Well, this is a private event. So we are your neighbors. Did you tell us that you were organizing a private event? We didn't have to. The police are there. They escort us away, and they say, no, just walk over the hill into Baintown and come back because the road's closed. Okay, fine. Once a private body accumulates a certain amount of space, they can close roads at will or at whim. It's a very whimsical approach to the neoliberal remapping of a city that claims to be empowering black people, but is actually, as the white man said standing at the gate, oh, I am not from here, I'm American, so I really can't get involved in this discussion. So there is the neoliberal map. Does it bother us that this place is closed off with open roads, toll booths, and a few gates? Lush hedges, succulent shrubs, and trees. Organized shade, benches for people to sit on, but not for me, not for us. People who do not look like us, people who do not sound like us. Because to the colonial register, our voices don't register. It's a level of silence that is actually decimating, yet we do not choose to see it because I am at home here, in this space between spaces, hidden by the margin of power in the ghettos of something on its way to becoming something else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Our final presentation for this afternoon, this session, is a paper written by A. Marie Seshine. She is professor of English at the University of Bahamas. She has an AA in English and psychology from the University of Bahamas, bachelor's in education in English, University of Miami, master's education in curriculum instruction, University of South Mississippi, and a PhD in English from Howard University. She teaches composition and literature courses, including advanced composition, Bahamian literature, Caribbean women literature, women West Indian literature. She has been published in the Journal of West Indian Literature, College Language Association Journal, Caribbean Journal of Psychology, C.L.R. James Journal, Caribbean Quarterly. The title of her paper or her presentation today is Whiteness as Other in the Construction of Bahamian National Identity. And our paper will be read by Dr. Craig Smith, Associate Professor, School of English Studies, University of the Bahamas. Welcome him.
Good afternoon, folks. I apologize that you have to look at this rather than Marie Searsing. But so I'll present her paper. I guess the title has changed a little bit. Her paper is Bahamian Identity, Reshaping the Narrative of Belonging. Throughout the many decades since the attainment of political independence in the Bahamas, the discourse on race has had a largely monovocal reverberation. Given that nationalist sentiment emerged within the framework of Black majority rule and the attainment of Black political power, discussions on forging a national identity, as Howard Johnson observes, focused on the articulation of a Black national identity. This position stood in sharp opposition to the decidedly white social and economic hegemony of the day that had peripheralized Black Bahamians, clearly seen in the often sparse and distorted historical representations in publications of the day. This Black national identity was left virtually unchallenged by the white Bahamian and other non-Black segments of the Bahamian populace, who, though they constituted the numerical minority, had always enjoyed the privileges of political, social, and economic power. The silence that has thus been observed regarding race and racial diversity has averted any real meaningful public discourse on the subject. While scholars and literary artists like Keith Russell, Patricia Glinton McColas, Nicolette Bethel, Helen Clanaris, and others have referenced race in their literary works and in their essays, and have invited in-depth discussions on the subject, the national posture has generally been one of avoidance. Russell, in his essay, Race in the Bahamas, a Dysfunctional Narrative, contends that racial hegemony in the Bahamas has been, quote, stymied by the conspiracy of silence, end quote. The submerged racial discourse that gave rise to a de facto Black national identity, however, warrants challenges if indeed a more inclusive ethos is to be actualized. addressing this very important lacunae in social and academic discourse and creating the mechanism for reopening and revoicing the muted dialogue of race and race relations is critical, not for the purpose of indulging recriminations that such engagements can elicit, but rather to re-dimensionalize the significance of race so as to engender the spirit of national belonging and promote the consciousness of solidarity which extend well beyond constructions of race. This paper seeks to examine ways in which articulations of belonging might be expressed within an inclusionary matrix of national identity, one that accords to all races and ethnic groupings within the body politic the right to their own cultural particularities and modes of being without necessarily seeing national cohesiveness as predicated on imperatives of homogeneity. For this discussion, I invoke Edward Glissant's concept of relation, which articulates an anti-essentialist stance acknowledging equality and enunciating a respect for difference. Glissant's rationality, grounded in non-hierarchical interrelatedness, foregrounds the diversity of the whole. As such, the whole requires the presence of all its distinct and equal elements to comprise its totality. Glissant's ontology of relations thus distinguishes between l'identité racine, root identity, and l'identité relation identity. This construct engages the idea of the rhizome to think of identity no longer as a single root, but as a root reaching out to meet other roots. The process whereby, quote, each and every identity is extended through a relationship with the other, end quote. Glissant's theoretical construct is particularly instructive at this juncture in the contemporary moment, given the increasingly multiracial, multi-ethnic reality of Bahamian society. This moment provides the basis for re-engaging the race debates within a more broadly conceptualized matrix of identity, one that acknowledges not only racial differences, but also the intersections of race, class, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, and other identity elements that are as crucial to reconceiving national identity. Bahamian identity politics and belonging must move beyond static black-white binaries and towards a reconceptualized national identity that productively illuminates levels of racial, ethnic, and cultural interlinkings, an undeniable fact of contemporary Bahamian existence. While national identity may be construed on the basis of a shared sense of history, a shared sense of space, and a singular allegiance to a shared destiny as a nation, the entrenched assertion of Bahamian identity of recent pre-independence vintage as a black identity with its racial imperative impedes such a construal and renders untenable the idea of national progress defined by the forward, upward, and onward mobility of a people within an ethos of togetherness. The inherently exclusionist principle that a black national identity seemingly asserts is problematic insofar as it invalidates the oft-expressed idea of national cohesiveness within the frame of a racially, ethnically, and culturally mixed society. As Shalini Puri observes in her post-nationalist critique of Caribbean nationalism, this notion of unity is invoked more in an attempt to produce it than to assert its actuality. The generic we invoked in black nationalist discourse often obfuscates important divisions along matrices not only of race, but also of ethnicity, class, and lineage, and is thus uttered alongside the quieter, though contested claims from these divisions, which militates against the molding of a national identity characterized by diversity. Further, the barely contained prejudice and inequities inherent in the social structures, and more tellingly, within the psyche of the people, gives way occasionally to eruptions that serve as a startling reminder of what smolders beneath the facade of a tranquil social unity. A recent letter to the editor of the Tribune registered the angry protest of a Haitian Bahamian male who issues threats against the state for demolishing his shantytown home, serves as a poignant example of this seething resentment among disenfranchised blacks, which could potentiate riotous disruptions within a seemingly serene Bahamas. Persons born in the Bahamas of Black Haitian parents are not automatically accorded citizenship and exist largely on the fringes of Bahamian society. Being Black, ironically, does not grant unfettered access into social acceptance, nor does it offer the assurance of full integration into Bahamian society. At the other end of the spectrum, being white and, by virtue of birth, a bona fide citizen does not always accord the person social recognition as a Bahamian. White Bahamians, as Sabrina Lyburn attests, are often mistaken for visitors and treated as aliens in their own country. There appears a somewhat schizophrenic undercurrent in the national ethos that marginalizes whites born in the Bahamas, but shows deference to white visitors and residents, that valorizes first-generation Bahamian-born blacks, but marginalizes Bahamian blacks whose roots of origin lie elsewhere. Perspectives on identity within the national rhetoric that insist upon a homogeneous, essentialized blackness as the epidermal marker of Bahamianness reveal a fragile construction at best, at worst an unattainable prospect. The emphasis on Bahamianness as racially constructed arises, at least in part, from the pervasive notion among many Black nationalists in the Caribbean region more broadly who, according to Gordon Lewis, quote, have seen the region as part of the African diaspora and have thus tended to overlook its European, Chinese, Greek, Hispanic, and other ethnic components, end quote. But the other dimensions of Bahamian identity has to do with territoriality, ownership of the physical land space, albeit delineated by particular types of boundaries, entitlement to which was conferred upon the citizens by virtue of the country's attainment of independence. This homeland is jealously guarded against the invasion of immigrants, some deemed undesirable or obstructive to national development. Howard Johnson observes that in the immediate post-independence era, the emphasis on homogeneity and belonging was in part, quote, a response to the incursion of immigrants from the rest of the British Caribbean and from Haiti, end quote, who came to the Bahamas in search of economic opportunity and for whom the Bahamas became home. This influx of predominantly Black migrants not only intensified first-generation Bahamians' awareness of the differentiated statuses of a bona fide Bahamian versus paper Bahamians, but also served to provide an element of cohesion among Bahamians of all hues, making clear distinctions between insiders and outsiders. Instead of dismantling barriers constructed by race and class within the national ethos then, the influx of immigrants served rather to widen the range of barriers based on ethnicity and place of origin. Migration, however, has been and continues to be a critical element in the Bahamian experience and, as such, has placed a crucial role in the delineation of Bahamian identity. So entrenched is the migratory experience that, according to Patricia Glinton-McColas, at some point along the continuum of movement, it has become a part of the personal history of each of us. Yet, not only is the differential lineage of or heritage of Bahamian citizens not accorded celebration, it is often concealed from the scrutiny of ardent nationalists. lest such citizens be deemed ineligible, disqualified from full social and economic integration. In order to shift the existing mindset regarding Bahamian national identity and belonging so that it becomes more inclusive, it is essential that we recognize the foundational elements, historical, cultural, ideological, spiritual, that are the contingents of our relationality, that we move away from what Eddie Suffant refers to as categorical identity and towards a more cohesive construct. Suffant reminds us that, quote, any assertion of a categorical identity is always an exclusion. In some cases, it is an exclusion of others, and in other cases, it is an exclusion of other options or possibilities of being, end quote. We need to escape the limitations imposed by current modes of thought and struggle to transform the other of consciousness that has been allowed to fossilize. As Glissant so fittingly asserts, quote, all human cultures have experienced an age of dogmatic certitude, end quote, but new ages bring forth new possibilities and charge us with the responsibility and indeed the courage to both transform and transcend. Contemporary Bahamian society, with its growing racial, ethnic, social, and cultural diversity, demands new protocols, new ways of conceiving Bahamianness and Bahamian national identity.
Thank you, Craig, on behalf of Maria. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Keisha. I'm sure we have a little time for some questions, comments. You'll have those now, please. Is another mic out there somewhere to help us for persons who want to ask questions?
I have a note from Sarah Singh. She says to please explain that this brief paper is a departure from the original topic submitted and is a work in progress and is intended to provoke the idea of an expanded concept of rational identity, relational identity, and of who can belong.
Yes.
I want to thank you.
Tell thanks.
I want to thank you for that. I must say, you make me think. But what I do think is this. We have a fractured society where you may wish to have homogeneity, but the reality doesn't reflect that. Let's look at the structures that we have. On death row, there are no white people. So our criminal justice system is on the backs of black people. In the economy, we may have one or two black millionaires who would have been given a piece of the pie, but the pie itself is really in the hands of the white community. Not to say all white people are rich, because you have some impoverished white people. But the reality is, and it's a social reality, that there's a very strong divide between black and white in this country, and it's a historical one. It's not something that's just wished away by saying, let's have a different discourse. I think our discourse has to be honest, and our discourse has to show the fault lines that race has created in our community. Race is an artificial construct. It's not a real construct. It was created by Europeans. And if it's going to be done away, Europeans have to change their mindset in order for there to be real changes. I don't think there's been reverse discrimination against the white community. If anything, after 50 years of independence, the white community have given us even stronger hold on our economy. You know, and it's very easy to mix up the foreign white and the local white because they are at the top of the pyramid structure. They sit at the top of it. You know, the Simonettes are part of the structure that includes foreign white people. So you do make me think, because it's a well-constructed piece of paper, and I would really like to read it and reflect on it more deeper. But this is just something that jumps at me. And I think it's evaded the writer of the paper. And it's also evaded a lot of the other analysis that has been done by others. And I think that needs to become part of the discourse. So I would like to read it, and I would like to respond to it in an informed way, rather at the heat of the moment. But that's just my initial thought.
I'm tempted to respond to a response, but I'll just say this, that what is real to post-independence is the persistence of white privilege. I'll give two anecdotals. One is my dad. Come out of high school, he went to Sacred Heart and then Aquinas, and by 61 he was fresh out of high school, no college degree, immediately got a job at the main branch of the Royal Bank of Canada. All the tellers were white. He would not have got that job if he was any other color than white. And I would know that white privilege persists, and I wrote about this in an op-ed that was published by UB. My nephew, UB student at the time, 23, 24, he's since graduated, lived with us, my wife and I and my daughter, for 5 years. We live in a well-to-do community in the east, off Eastern Road. And he had, at the time, fairly long hair. And he would be out in the yard on his phone doing whatever he was doing. And it was amazing. Erica, you live in the neighborhood, or you used to live in the neighborhood I'm referencing. I just happen to know that. But anyways, the police would come by in our neighborhood for some odd reason and always stop him. And then, on top of that, they would ask him to go inside the house he lives in and produce his passport or identification to say he actually lived with us. This is not 1954, this is not 1974. This is 2020. This is like 3 years ago. So I'm telling you that this stuff is real and we need to address it. So that's a comment. I have a question for Keisha. Yeah, see, that's true, He's a black Bahamian. Right, but you knew that. Yeah. So, right. So my question to you, Keisha, is, okay, this year, just very recently, sailing has been identified as our national sport instead of cricket, for all the obvious reasons. No one plays cricket, no one understands it, mostly. I don't understand it. And I watch sports. But you talked about us owning a boat, but you have people like Raleigh Gray, Hezron Moxie, who made not just a living by building boats, but sailing them. And there is an argument that could be made that, and forgive me because I spoke about Junkanoo being sort of quintessential to, but in the Family Islands for many, regatta and sailing is quintessential to their existence, to who they are, to culture. So how do you reconcile what I just said to what you were saying about boats? And I think I know the answer, but I want to hear what you have to say.
I guess I don't understand what needs to be reconciled, right? Because that is what I am describing as what I desire for all of us, right? Not only the people in the Family Islands, and I thank God that they've been able to hold on to that, right? I'm ecstatic to know how many people are still connected to the ocean and to the water, especially in the Family Islands, and that's just great news. And Dr. Curry, thank you so much. I know that you've put work into capturing their stories, and I am so looking forward to having the privilege of seeing the film that was produced about Bahamian sailors. All right, but I think what I'm asking is for that to be taken from the realm of the romantic, right, and into the actual lived experiences of average Bahamians. And if the majority of the population lives in New Providence, then we need to bring that to New Providence and not just keep it as a part of the, it's become a part of the myth that we told tourists and then believed ourselves. Right? So we know that Bahamians are seafaring people, and we know that there are these family island communities that are still built around sailing and the ocean. But I feel like in our psyche as the city folk in town, we've compartmentalized that along with all of the other myths that we've come to tell about the country in which we live.
Can I comment on something that Mr. Hanna said? One of the things that strikes us very, very profoundly is that there's a group of people who left around independence, who were born in the Bahamas, so have this automatic right to Bahamian citizenship. They left at independence, and they returned in the 1990s to take up positions in a particular group, and this remapping has been a part of their their transnational relations with the global capital of banking, of shipping, of cruise ship ownership. So these are partnerships that have been created throughout the Caribbean now, and they are being replicated, and the people who have, as you say, built the country on their backs are the ones who are now being dislocated, displaced, and disempowered all over again.
Hi. I really appreciate, Keisha, the political praxis that you brought to the discussion. And so I want to ask Ian if he were to develop a political praxis around the decolonization of place, what would be some of the steps that you would advocate? Training
Police differently, for one, because and a much more equitable understanding of spatial organization, because space is socially organized, right? But most people in the Bahamas do not go into Lyford Key. They don't go into Albany. So when we were under lockdown, they were not. People could move around freely, so there is a social justice or an access to justice that has to be brought into conversation, and not just conversation, but entrenched in the law. And the colonial laws of the Vagrancy Act and the ways the laws work together to disempower has to be rethought, because just the investment acts alone are not about Bahamians. Sorry, they're not about most Bahamians. They're not about the majority. They are about a small group of people who have a massive capital and who can invest $10 million to buy a graveyard on whichever island. I'm not going to call names. So just the ways that the laws are framed has to change. The ways that the policing laws are framed has to change. And the way that we punish has to change. So those three, and then to begin that, the way that we educate has to change, because we are still functioning in a 1900s colonial mindset of this is what we learn. We still have not decolonized that. So the way we see ourselves, we have to be able to see ourselves more truly, whatever that means, and more holistically, and understand that we are whole people, not others within a disinherited, disenfranchised, and unworthy group of blacks. So have I answered your question, Michael? So,
all right. Good afternoon. So my question is for Ian, because Keisha, I ain't buying a boat. And then actually, my question directly follows Michael's, in fact, because I make an active decision not to drive across the front of Great Cliff. Because that road, in my view, is closed most days, even though it appears to be open. I don't know.
Which one?
The road in front of Great Cliff.
It is, sir.
Okay? I actively avoid that road. So my question to you in this whole notion of reorganization, space, and remapping, am I now complicit?
No. But the challenge is, now that this has happened, and I didn't recognize it, I mean, I was sitting in traffic for 15 minutes trying to get to work one morning, and I'm like, what is this? It wasn't until that night when we were told we could not go back to the gallery that I tried to explain to people that this is really a problem. But it is empowered by the law and the way that the law allows this privatization of public space to happen. Because there's a certain amount of ownership that once you own the majority of the property, you can just do what you want. There is precedent. The precedent, unfortunately, has dispossessed most Bahamians. If we look at the Guanakee case, the second Guanakee case, I think it was, where Justice Carroll talks about the fact that Guanakee has to now accept the fact that development will happen, even though it dispossesses them because it benefits the majority of Bahamians. That's a huge statement. I mean, it's a bit addictive, but it's also really problematic because it establishes a way of thinking that allows legal apartheid to just slip right back in. And we see the same thing with the Bimini Bay case. So, and I think that was a moment that has now, that ship has sailed, because even with the Paradise Island case, where a particular organization has been allowed to close the public easement whenever they wish to. So by normalizing the closure of the public easement, you basically extinguish the easement. And how we get people to understand this, and I don't want to say react against it, but really to build an informed and credible response to it is huge. Because the lawyer for that organization knowingly closes that beach access every Friday and it reopens on Monday. Because that's when most black Bahamians will go to the beach. Michael, where's my?
Yeah, in the interest of time, we're going to let these two be the last. Unfortunately, we want to get into the last session, please.
Or maybe Mr. Hannon.
So great. My question and comment is directed towards Keisha. So Keisha, I just wanted to say, it almost is like your presentation is like based off a Facebook post I made. It's not, but I'm just saying, it got the exact same reaction. One of the interesting things, because it got shared all over the place, I had asked, since sailing was a national sport, how pragmatic is for Bahamians to be able to afford a boat? And out of the 60-something comments on my post, I noticed most people from the Family Islands all say that it's a Nassau problem and they don't care. And interestingly about that, I pointed out, as like, you may see it that way, but the Family Islands are quite factually depopulating. If you look at the last census data, previously Nassau had 69-point-something% of the population, now it's over 75%. Freeport is also depopulating. So what's actually and factually happening is the young people are leaving these communities. And if you actually talk to some of them, which I did, I reached out to some people privately, and I asked them, do they themselves own boats or their parents do? 100% said no, and they can't afford to do so. But they have access to people who can. And I made an interesting observation about that. From going to south of Eleuthera to Rock Sound, Greencastle, all of it, going all the way up to North Eleuthera, visiting Spanish Wells, staying there for a few nights, plus going to Auburn, I made an interesting observation that most of the ownership of not just boats, but also enterprises within these communities are owned by a handful of families. So the reality is, it's the same handful of people within these communities who are men, predominantly, that own the businesses, also own the boats. And the majority of people in the communities are poor. But we seem to not see the connection between those things because we relate access to something that you may have, which is tenuous and can be cut off, like we see in Nassau with beaches, to you not having access to these things. My question, I suppose, is not necessarily how do we change the mindset towards boat ownership in the Bahamas, but how do we bridge the logistical gap that exists? For the same reason I spoke to you about, why is it that I can buy fresh fruits and vegetables in Rock Sound or Eleuthera, but if I go to Governor's Harbor, which is supposed to be, last I checked, I'm not sure if it still is, the capital of the island, I can't get fresh fruits and vegetables, but it's grown on the same island. But in Nassau, I can buy the produce made in Rock Sound at a cheaper price than I can buy it in Rock Sound. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I think it's going to be the same relationship with boats in this country because Bahamians who live in New Providence, which is where 75% of the population is, can't afford slippage. Most people don't have trucks to move the boat. So the associated costs of these things disqualify you from participating. And I see the exact same things replicating in the Family Islands. But like I said, I'm wrong. So my question is how do we, I've been told that I'm wrong by Family Island people. So how do we rectify that?
I'll try to answer really briefly because I know we're well over time. And I think that my biggest argument today is that I want Bahamians to want to own a boat. If I have accomplished that, then I feel like I've been successful because I think that all of those issues that you addressed, all of the barriers to boat ownership exist primarily because nobody cares enough that they do. Right? So once we've decided that, hey, no, this is actually something that I want, then we realize that there are ways to address all of these issues that exist, right? And it takes a communal effort, right? Of course, the market will get involved, right? Because if someone figures out that, oh, wait, if we make this easier for Bahamians, we can capitalize on it, then you will see all of these doors opening up. So I think that there's the thing that we need to do in this room right now is decide that we want it and decide that we deserve it, right? And then all of those other practical barriers that we're discussing, we can work those things out, right? That's the easy part. The easiest part is convincing us that it's something that we should want.
I just want to comment on that as well, because one of the challenges you have there is that the points of access are diminishing. Not just the beaches, the ramps that you can use to get your boats in and out of the water are disappearing because the private investor feels threatened by this chaos that is black masculinity, putting the boat in the water and loud and carrying on and pissing on the side of the thing. So this is a challenge. I mean, there are two really popular ones. There's one at Montague and another one at Gambia, but there's smaller ones like Fox Hill Creek, Jaws Beach, that, you know, they're there, but if we don't use them, they will take them away. They will disappear. So there has to be a different way of approaching, just like Keisha says, there has to be a different conversation about empowering us again to be more aware.
Quickly. So in and this is to Ian and Keisha, but in the Indaba project that I worked with, an after-school project located over the hill, one of the main things that we would do is simply just take the children to the beach and like teach them how to swim. And it was amazing that a lot of the children in the program perceived as the beach as a place for tourists, right? Not as a space for them. So I'm wondering if I'm being oversimplistic in thinking that, like, yeah, buy boats, but also learn how to swim. Right? And like, as we're in these family, everybody has a family chat group, right? Like, each person in the chat group put together and buy a boat as a family. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Learn. The number of Bahamians that don't know how to swim is appalling. And I mean, Nyambe, I have nothing to say, but of course, I agree. There's no reason why every Bahamian doesn't know how to swim or doesn't even understand why they should know how to swim. Absolutely, and it just further illustrates how disconnected we are from our own country.